Hi, welcome to the first Simplified Anatomy and Physiology for Athletes. This one is going to be kind of a walkthrough of kind of the tools I use to describe anatomy and physiology. And first of 15, and I'm going to launch them in groups of 5. So here we go. People biomechanics. That's just the name of my company. But the way I describe anatomy and physiology, I tend to use a bit of mechanical phrases to really describe an anatomical structural build along with its functionality. All right, so within those 15 videos, I basically, for the first 5, describe the basic design. For the second 5, I describe the reproductive design. And then the last 5, I describe the female pregnancy design, but we do add on to the kind of both the basic design for the male design and the reproductive design for the male design. We do touch on that in the last 5 presentations. It's more so just kind of like completing content, but as it just regards the male basic design and reproductive design. All right, so biomechanics, that can be simply described as the mechanics of a person's body. And mechanics, they're generally structural things. Usually solids is a nice way to introduce examples, at least. So here are some mechanical words, some mechanical parts, some mechanical tools, and machines. So for parts, we've got some examples being beams and brackets, and you put some of those parts together. You could consider it a tool, which usually is defined as making a job easier, and in this case for form for something, but you've got yourself a frame. And then for mechanical examples, so mechanical words, machine is one of them, and that can be defined as an engine. So mechanical machines are generally defined by being able to run on their own. All right, so analogous to that, we've got biomechanical things. So biomechanical parts, biomechanical tools, and biomechanical organs. Some example of biomechanical parts, bones and ligaments. And for a biomechanical tool, again, describing something as a tool is basically just a part that can make a job easier. And a lot of the kind of the format that I use here is form and mobility for biomechanics. And so you put some bones and ligaments together and you've got yourself a skeletal frame. Definitely helping with form and also mobility. All right, so instead of using the word machine, for biomechanical things, organs are much more fitting for that. And they can be described as being able to run on their own. I more so in this context really define them as making or moving material or modulating for a type of process like that. So definitely able to run on their own as well, but I kind of more so define them with a few more descriptors as it regards making and or moving materials. So heart is a great example. All right, so I describe anatomy and physiology here very simply with a list of parts and then a list of functions. We've got 7 buckets for basic design parts. And sometimes they're not going to have parts in them, and that's totally fine. And then we've got a list of functions. So it's kind of easy, these are always the same. So that is your simple anatomy and physiology for the basic design. All right, so when we go through this, basically we're going to take those functions and we're going to look at them in 5 different columns, and they really are going to help to describe those functions a little bit more. And it kind of expands on the functionality, yet it limits it because there's got to be each of those contexts columns has like a requirement alongside. All right, so here we go. So we'll then place parts that like could make sense alongside those functions, but the template is really just for functionality, and then we can kind of go through and be like, yeah, you could put that part there, totally. Lastly, when we're done with the template, we'll go to the scaffold and we'll work more so with the anatomical regions, and then we'll place fittings and fixtures alongside. So the parts that coincide with fittings and fixtures. All right, so I really just have 2 slide backgrounds, and I introduced this here just so you're not like, what is that for? Like later on, and so yeah. So when I'm working with the template, it's basically I'll have these little hash marks there. And I really do that just so I don't have to have all the columns in there at once. And then this is the other slide background. And you can, like, if you have this printed out, you can go ahead and write stuff down with the template. Yeah. All right. So in this first presentation, we do that flow for just of course, the basic design, but just for the outer structure parts. All right. So here's a list of parts for those parts buckets, and that's all we'll have for the outer structure basic design. All right, so now we'll go through the template. And these shaded squares are really the only ones we're like really interested in, but we'll kind of run through the motions, and so like we start with the 7th shaded square, and so we'll look at the function for group 7, and then we'll look at the context for that column, the first column, and then we'll go through there. So if there isn't a part in a bucket, no worries. This is just kind of to start getting used to working with the template. All right, so this first time through, I'll touch on material type, and it's really as simple as, is that material a solid, a liquid, or a gas? All right, so for the first context for that first column, the part is, in addition to the foundational functionality, it needs to be a solid. All right, so we'll put solids up there, very cool. And we'll go ahead and we'll look at the parts list and the functions list, and then that first column in the template, which in addition to a part helping with the packaging for the overall design, it will also be required for it to be a solid. All right, so all the parts are really solids, and so you can kind of put them all out there, no worries. And it's kind of like if you're running through this on your own and you're like, how would I decide that? Here's a sentence you can say and kind of fill in the blanks. Is this part mostly, provides that functionality and is also a solid? You can just use mostly. It doesn't have to be anything technical. All right. So now what we do before we go back to the template is that we remove all of these parts and we just leave the anatomical part alongside the gray box. And then we kind of associate it with that column, and yeah. All right, so we've got column 2. The contextual requirement is that it's also a solid. So we go to the foundational function, and then we go to that column context, and we go from there. So that was the first column, and now we're going to go to the second column with the parts list. We'll say, okay, foundationally, the function that we're looking at is, do any of these parts help with form for overall design? And also is a solid. So all of them definitely help with form. So we kind of plop them out there. Okay, cool. Go ahead and clean up all the parts that aren't near the gray box in the column. And then we associate that part alongside the gray box in the template. All right, so together those parts compose what's called the musculoskeleton. Now we'll go to the third column. And it's not so much is this part a solid, a liquid, or a gas, but it's more so is this part involved in moving material in and or out of the overall unit. All right, so we've got the context at the top of that column. And then we'll go ahead and we'll look at the parts list and the functions list. And we've already looked at the template enough or worked with it enough to know that in the end we clean up all the parts that are not associated with this gray box. So in the end we're not going to have anything there. But we can look at this and be like, all right, so do any of these things help with bringing material in and excreting material from the overall unit? Totally. Hands help to bring food to someone's mouth, and like no big deal stuff. But all right, well, we're just kind of running through the motions and learning how to use the template, but yeah. All right, so nothing to clean up, so we'll go to column 4. And the context for that column is really cultivating materials within a generic anatomical build. So those materials could be solids, liquids, or gas, no big deal. And for the outer structure, we named the column there, cultivating materials. And then we'll go ahead and we'll look at that parts list and the functions list. And similar to the last one, we already know there's not going to be any any parts alongside, and we don't have to clean anything up. And just kind of looking at this, does anything really, not much. This is pretty much the outer structure, so it makes sense not to put anything alongside there even. Yeah. All right, so the last column in this template, the context is sensory design. And for kind of example purposes a little bit, it's sensory design. But kind of as it regards what we're looking at in the template, it's we've got an outer structure and it's moving materials in and out of a unit, and then cultivating materials within a unit. So, all right, sensory design. We'll start with that. All right, so the requirement would be that it would have to do something with sensory design for moving materials in and out of a unit, which would be more applicable for outer structure design. Not so much cultivating materials, but you could go ahead and say, okay, my hands touch food and can help bring that into, yeah, you can do that, that'd be all right. And skin, of course. And so either way, we know that there aren't any parts associated with this column. So very cool. So we finished the template for the outer structure design, or the outer structure parts for the basic design. All right, very cool. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do some anatomical regions. And here you go. These are the anatomical regions in order. And this is basically the outer structure core region. So this is something to note, like if you were building like a model of an anatomical build kind of thing, if you have a mannequin or something like that, this is kind of where we start. And so just checking out the scaffold, we've got those curly brackets on the left side indicating the outer structure core region. And then we're also going to kind of name the generalized anatomical regions. So those are the curly brackets on the right side. And so here are the building instructions for placing fittings and fixtures for outer structure. You start with that outer structure core region, and you add on the fittings, parts that connect end parts, and fixtures, which are end parts. So the function is really capping off a unit, and fittings can help you do that better. All right. So we'll start out here, and we've got our parts list for fittings, and then we've got obviously the function being the functionality, providing the functionality of being a fitting for an overall structure. And so we'll place these parts alongside pretty much their anatomical region. And kind of the rule here is that you at least need to stay within the general anatomical region. Now we'll go ahead and we'll place the fixtures also in their anatomical region. And that is the scaffold. All right, So we've got presentation to, when we do the next presentation, it's going to have it's going to have the sensory parts there, and a lot of them are on, generic anatomical build, just the head region. And so these are the head regions, I guess. And you've got kind of in order, it's upper forehead, lower forehead, eyes, nose, then it's ears, and then it's mouth, and it's chin. An easy way to remember it would be that eyes, nose, ears, and mouth are on the right side of a person. It's a Z formation. And then I guess I just went through the same build instructions, but all right, so we'll use the same type of scaffold and place interstructure parts on it. So always fittings and fixtures for scaffold. All right, so kind of touching back on the beginning of the presentation, and then kind of hanging out with some of the content I've shared in the presentation. So for biomechanical things, we've got parts, tools, and organs. And a lot of times I'll use the word mechanism in place of tool, and I don't do it to specify anything differently. It's just, they're the same to me as far as how I organize stuff in these presentations. And then to kind of touch on, all of these things can be considered parts as far as how I organize this stuff. But parts are on the simpler side, and then it works towards more intricate parts. And then we'll go ahead and we'll look at the parts and the functions list, and we'll kind of touch on that a little bit. So you'll see me group things like so. We've got parts, there's 7 buckets, and functions, there's 7 squares. And we'll go through here and kind of simplify this by adding some understanding. So one thing to note, the parts list can be thought of as just parts, just to keep things very simple. As we go through this, we'll touch on a little bit more of why a part that could be considered a tool, why that is just making a job easier, and usually that function or that job would be form and or mobility. So that's all the way to the right. And form and mobility is good, especially for athletic stuff. Eventually I'll mention that can also be thought of as mechanistic functionality. And that's not for a few more presentations, but we're just kind of hanging with this and allowing for things to gel. So one thing to mention is, of course, I've got on the left side parts that are just parts, and then organs. So to note, these are the most intricate types of parts. And then lastly, those are parts that could be considered tools or mechanisms. Those are the ones that are kind of in the middle as far as simplicity to intricacy, kind of. Sorry, trying to find the English words here. So for an outer structure, it makes sense that we didn't have any organs there. People generally don't have organs for their basic design on the outside of their bodies. But yeah, so in this, the way I describe simplified anatomy and physiology is really looking at a generic anatomical build and looking at it as a systematic unit. So as we kind of get into further presentations, it will be talking about systematic functionality for just systematic organs, systematic parts, which can be considered organs, for first just the systematic functionality. And then, like the 8th presentation, we get into organs, how they can also help with mechanistic functionality in addition to the kind of basic systematic functionality. And then lastly, we touch on how organs help with not just systematic functionality, and we really stick with the basic design, but also mechanistic functionality, and then just the functionality as it regards capping off a unit. All right, so I have an optional worksheet if you'd like to go through and do this. Should be pretty straightforward, as a lot of the first presentation here is just kind of going through and getting used to the tools I use to describe simplified anatomy and physiology for athletes. So we've got those parts buckets, go through the template. Then you can do the scaffold with just the fittings and fixtures. In the second sheet, this is kind of cool. This is kind of fill in the blank with the part, and then provides the function of, then fill in the blank with the given function, and then it's for overall unit. And feel free to present this to someone. I think it's kind of cool. It's kind of fun to put these simple words. And usually when you're talking about anatomy and physiology, it can be really flowy. So go ahead and give it a try. And that is the end of the first presentation. Thank you so much. And the next presentation covers the inner structure design.